It all began the summer my wife, Claire, and I finally closed on our dream property. A quiet, sprawling 3-acre lot nestled on the outskirts of town where the pines grew tall, the air smelled fresh, and the only sounds you could usually hear were the wind whispering through the trees or the occasional hum of a truck driving down the distant county road. And for us, it was more than just land and a house. It was freedom, a chance to build a life away from the chaos of the city and free from the petty politics of neighborhoods that always seem to turn grown adults into squabbling children. And yet, little did we know that moving here would entangle us in one of the pettiest, most absurd neighborhood conflicts imaginable, centered around a woman we would later come to know, unfortunately all too well, as HOA Karen. From the moment we pulled up the gravel driveway, Claire squeezed my hand in excitement, and I couldn't help but admire the way her eyes lit up when she saw the wraparound porch, the sturdy log beams, and the wide-open lawn where she already pictured hosting barbecues and letting our dogs run free. But what thrilled me the most was that this house came with no strings attached, no binding homeowners association contracts, no rule book dictating what color we could paint the siding or whether we could park a pickup truck in the driveway, no busybodies telling us how often to mow the grass or when to put up Christmas decorations. It was just us, our property, and the freedom we'd worked so hard to finally afford. The realtor had even chuckled during the signing when I asked if there was any HOA oversight, shaking her head firmly and assuring us, no HOA, no fees, no headaches. This neighborhood is independent. You're on your own here, and that statement had felt like music to my ears because I'd grown up in one of those picture-perfect suburban developments where every little detail was micromanaged, and I remembered my dad ranting about getting fined $50 because he left the trash can at the curb a few hours too long, or how my mom had to argue for months with the HOA board to keep the vegetable garden she loved in the backyard. Claire, though, had an even stronger distaste for HOAs, and for good reason. What most people didn't know was that she wasn't just my wife, she was also the county sheriff, and in her line of work, she'd seen far too many disputes that started with something petty like HOA fines and escalated into ridiculous civil complaints, harassment charges, or even outright criminal behavior, and she often joked that HOAs seemed to attract wannabe dictators with nothing better to do than write people up for having the wrong kind of mailbox. So, when we found a beautiful property free of all that nonsense, we thought we'd hit the jackpot. But it didn't take long after moving in for us to meet the self-proclaimed neighborhood president, a woman named Karen, who, despite having no official authority whatsoever, had appointed herself the guardian of what she called the standards of the community. Our first encounter with her was almost laughable. She marched right up the driveway as we were unloading boxes from a moving truck, clipboard in hand, wearing oversized sunglasses that made her look like a budget version of some reality TV diva. And without even introducing herself, she barked, "I'll need to get you signed up for the HOA. We like to get new residents squared away immediately so there's no confusion about the rules." I blinked at her, confused, because the realtor had been very clear, and I said flatly, "There is no HOA here. That's one of the reasons we bought the place." But Karen just gave a condescending little laugh, wagged her finger at me, and said, "Oh, honey, the realtor probably told you that just to make the sale. We absolutely have an HOA. I've been running it for 10 years. Everyone here is part of it, and everyone pays their dues. Don't worry, it's only $200 a month, and in exchange, we keep this neighborhood classy. That means no junk cars, no loud parties, no non-standard fencing, and definitely no law enforcement vehicles parked outside where they ruin the aesthetic." That last part made Claire stiffen beside me, because she drove her patrol SUV home sometimes, and this woman had already decided it was unacceptable, and I could practically feel the temperature drop as Claire's jaw tightened, but she stayed calm and replied evenly, "Ma'am, there's no HOA governing this property, and even if there were, no one has the authority to tell me what vehicle I can or cannot drive as part of my job." Karen waved her hand dismissively like Claire was some unruly child and said, "We'll see about that. I'll give you the paperwork to sign tonight. Refusing to join isn't an option. Around here, I make the rules." With that, she strutted off, leaving both of us stunned, and I remember letting out a disbelieving laugh asking Claire if that woman was serious, and Claire muttered, "Oh, she's serious, and she's going to be a problem." Over the next few days, it became very clear just how much of a problem Karen intended to be. She began dropping off letters in our mailbox demanding dues payments, taping notices to our front door claiming we were in violation of community standards because we hadn't mowed the lawn yet, even though we'd barely moved in, and even stopping me on my way to work to scold me about the length of our grass and warn that repeat violations will result in fines. Every time, I reminded her that there was no HOA here, that her threats were meaningless, and that she had no authority to issue fines, but she just smirked and said, "Everyone pays. Everyone follows the rules. You'll learn." Claire, meanwhile, was growing less amused by the day. She didn't reveal her position as sheriff at first because she wanted to see how far Karen would push the charade, but I could tell from the way Claire's patience wore thinner and thinner that it was only a matter of time before Karen crossed a line. That line finally came one Thursday evening when Karen stormed up the driveway again, this time furious because Claire had parked her sheriff's SUV in front of our house after getting off a long shift, and Karen, red-faced and sputtering, yelled loud enough for the neighbors across the street to hear, "That vehicle is not permitted in this neighborhood. It's intimidating, it's an eyesore, and it violates the covenant rules. If you refuse to move it, I'll have no choice but to call the police." At that, Claire slowly turned, leveled her gaze at Karen, and in her calm but commanding sheriff's tone said, "You do that. Call the police." Karen must have thought it was a bluff because she whipped out her phone right there and dialed 911, shouting into the receiver that she needed officers dispatched immediately because a resident is refusing to comply with HOA rules and is threatening the integrity of the neighborhood. When she hung up, she smirked triumphantly at us and said, "We'll just see how long you last here once the cops get involved." I glanced at Claire, and the little half smile playing at the corner of her mouth told me she was more than ready for what was about to happen because Karen had no idea that the offending resident she'd just sicked the police on was the sheriff herself, the very authority those officers answered to. The call that Karen so confidently placed that evening turned out to be the spark that truly set everything in motion. Because while she had envisioned a pair of uniformed officers showing up lecturing us and forcing Claire to remove her sheriff's vehicle from our own driveway, the reality played out in a way so spectacularly opposite to her expectations that it would have been comical if it weren't so disruptive. And as we stood there on the porch watching her pace with self-satisfaction, muttering things like, "This will teach them," and "No one disrespects the HOA" on my watch, I kept my arm crossed and my lips pressed tight, doing everything I could not to laugh outright, because I knew exactly what was about to happen when those officers arrived. It took maybe 10 minutes for the first squad car to pull up, lights off, but clearly dispatched to check on what Karen had described as some kind of unruly, non-compliant neighbor situation, and the moment the officers stepped out, Karen rushed over to them like she had just found reinforcements in a personal war, waving her clipboard and screeching about how we were violating covenants and how the sheriff's vehicle is an eyesore and a danger to property values, and the officers trying to maintain their professionalism glanced past her at Claire and me, their eyes widening almost immediately when they recognized exactly who was standing in front of them. "Sheriff," one of them said in disbelief, straightening his posture and nodding respectfully toward Claire, who stood with her arms casually folded, her badge glinting on her belt because she hadn't even bothered to cover it when she got home earlier. And at that, Karen's rant hit a screeching halt as she blinked back and forth between Claire and the officers, confusion painting her face as if the puzzle pieces weren't fitting together. "Excuse me," Karen snapped, recovering quickly with the bravado only someone truly oblivious could muster. "I don't care who she is, she's in violation of HOA standards, and you need to cite her, fine her, or remove that vehicle immediately. This is my community, and I demand compliance." The younger officer nearly choked, trying not to laugh, while the senior officer cleared his throat and said as diplomatically as possible, "Ma'am, with all due respect, there is no HOA jurisdiction here. And even if there were, the sheriff is fully within her rights to park her vehicle on her property. There's nothing criminal, civil, or enforceable about what you're complaining about." Claire took a step forward then, her presence commanding the way it always was when she was on duty, and said firmly, "Karen, I've given you the benefit of the doubt, hoping you'd back down once you realized we aren't part of your imaginary HOA. But now you've wasted police resources, filed a false complaint, and attempted to misuse emergency services because you don't like the sight of a law enforcement vehicle. That is not only inappropriate, it's potentially criminal. Karen's face twisted with indignation, her voice rising another octave as she screamed, "How dare you threaten me? You think just because you're the sheriff you're above the rules? Nobody is above the rules, not even you. This neighborhood has standards, and if you won't follow them willingly, I'll drag you through every court I can find until you're forced out." By now, several neighbors had gathered quietly along the edges of their yards, drawn out by the commotion, some of them clearly embarrassed by Karen's theatrics, others whispering among themselves with looks of barely concealed amusement, because it was becoming clear that this wasn't the first time Karen had gone on one of her crusades, though it might have been the first time she'd picked a fight with someone who could and would stand up to her without flinching. Claire, never one to be rattled, simply looked Karen dead in the eyes and said, "If you continue down this path, you're going to find out very quickly what real consequences look like. You have no HOA. You have no legal standing. What you're doing right now is harassment, and I suggest you stop." That should have been the end of it, but of course, Karen wasn't the type to let go. Instead, she doubled down in the days that followed, escalating from angry rants and fake violation notices to full-blown smear campaigns where she printed up flyers accusing us of being dangerous influences in the neighborhood and slipped them into people's mailboxes, and she even went so far as to stage a community meeting in her backyard where she tried to rally neighbors into signing a petition to enforce the HOA that didn't exist. Claire and I watched from our porch that Saturday evening as a handful of curious folks wandered into Karen's yard, only to come back out shaking their heads minutes later, muttering that the woman had lost it. But the real kicker came when Karen attempted to issue us a fine of $1,000 for failure to comply with mandatory HOA enrollment, slipping a letter into our mailbox that looked suspiciously like it had been cobbled together from a free legal template she found online, complete with fake letterhead and a warning that non-payment may result in property liens. Claire brought the letter inside, tossed it on the kitchen counter, and laughed harder than I'd seen her laugh in months, because she knew as well as I did that Karen had just crossed into a whole new level of fraud by pretending to have authority she absolutely didn't, and if she kept pushing, she was going to land herself in genuine legal jeopardy. Still, Claire wanted to give her a chance to back off without dragging it into official channels, so she went next door the following day to talk to Karen directly, and I went with her just in case things got heated. Karen met us at the door, smug and defiant, arms crossed as if she was expecting us to beg for forgiveness, and before Claire could even get a word out, Karen thrust another stack of violation notices at us, declaring, "I don't care who you think you are. You're going to follow the rules, or I'll make your lives miserable." That's how this works. Claire held up a hand, her patience finally gone, and said in that low, dangerous tone she used when dealing with suspects who were about to talk themselves into a jail cell, "Karen, listen carefully. If you continue this behavior, harassment, fraudulent notices, misuse of emergency services, I will have no choice but to pursue charges. This is your final warning. Stop or face the consequences." For a brief second, I thought I saw hesitation flicker across Karen's face, but then she sneered and said, "You don't scare me. You might be the sheriff, but around here I'm the law." That was the exact moment Claire's eyes hardened with a decision, and as we walked back across the lawn, she muttered to me, "She just signed her own ticket. If she wants to play law, we'll play law." And sure enough, the very next week, after Karen once again tried to slap us with another bogus fine and left yet another threatening letter taped to our door, Claire officially opened a harassment case, documenting every interaction, saving every notice, and even pulling the dispatch logs from the night Karen called 911 on us to prove her misuse of emergency resources. And while Claire was careful to handle everything by the book, assigning another deputy to manage the investigation so it couldn't be accused of being personal, everyone in the department knew what was going on, and they all seemed more than a little eager to finally hold the self-proclaimed HOA queen accountable for the chaos she had been stirring up in the neighborhood for years. By the time the harassment case had been opened, the entire neighborhood had become aware that the self-proclaimed HOA president was finally facing some pushback, and the ripple effect it caused was nothing short of fascinating, because people who had quietly endured Karen's antics for years suddenly began coming forward, emboldened by the fact that Claire was willing to stand up to her, and what started as a few whispered conversations across driveways quickly grew into a steady stream of phone calls to the sheriff's office, where neighbors reported similar harassment, bogus fines, and even threats Karen had made in the past, all under the guise of HOA authority that had never actually existed. One older couple recounted how she had tried to force them to repaint their shutters 3 times because she didn't like the shade of blue they'd chosen. Another family admitted she'd harassed their teenage son for parking his old pickup truck in front of their house. And yet another neighbor revealed she demanded monthly dues payments from them for years, all in cash without ever providing a receipt, and now they realized they had likely been scammed. Claire's deputy compiled these complaints methodically, building a thick file of documented incidents that painted a picture not of a concerned neighbor trying to maintain standards, but of a petty tyrant exploiting her neighbors through intimidation, manipulation, and outright fraud. The irony was that Karen didn't seem to realize how much trouble she was in. If anything, she seemed to double down in her delusions, strutting around the neighborhood with her clipboard, muttering about how she was being persecuted for enforcing rules that everyone agreed to when they moved in, and loudly insisting that the sheriff was targeting her unfairly, even as the evidence piled higher and higher against her. I'll never forget one evening when Claire and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the rare peace of a cool sunset, when Karen marched down the street handing out flyers that said in big bold letters, "Stop the corruption, remove the sheriff from our community," with bullet points accusing Claire of abusing her authority, refusing to follow HOA standards, and threatening honest residents. Claire just shook her head, more amused than anything, and said, "She has no idea she's digging her own grave." And I had to agree, because the more Karen fought, the more foolish she looked, and the less patience the community had for her antics. The real turning point came during a county council meeting 2 weeks later, where Karen, having worked herself into a frenzy, actually tried to present her case against Claire in front of the council members, waving her stack of fake violation notices and screaming about how the sheriff was destroying the sanctity of the neighborhood. And I wish I could fully capture the stunned silence in the room when Claire calmly stood, addressed the council, and laid out the facts that no HOA existed for our neighborhood, that Karen had been fraudulently demanding dues and issuing fake fines, that she had misused emergency services, and that multiple residents had filed complaints of harassment and intimidation. She even presented copies of Karen's official notices, which the council members examined with raised eyebrows and exchanged looks of disbelief at how sloppy and obviously illegitimate they were. When Claire concluded by saying, "This behavior has gone unchecked for far too long, and my office is pursuing it through the proper legal channels," the room erupted in applause from several neighbors who had attended just to support her, and the council president, clearly exasperated, turned to Karen and said, "Ma'am, there is no legal foundation for anything you've been doing. You cannot invent authority you do not have. If you continue this, you will face serious consequences." Most people would have taken that as the end of the line, but not Karen. She stormed out of the meeting in a rage, muttering about conspiracies and corruption, and within days she escalated to her boldest stunt yet. She tried to file an actual civil lawsuit against us, demanding thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA dues and damages to neighborhood value caused by sheriff's vehicle presence. When the court received her filing, it was almost immediately flagged as frivolous, but Claire, ever meticulous, made sure to attend the hearing in uniform, not because she needed to, but because she wanted Karen to fully grasp the gravity of what she was doing. And I sat beside her in the courtroom as the judge skimmed through Karen's so-called evidence, looked over his glasses at her, and said, "Ma'am, this is not only baseless, it borders on fraudulent. There is no HOA. There are no dues. This case is dismissed with prejudice." Karen erupted in a dramatic tirade about injustice and favoritism, accusing the judge of being in on it with Claire, until the bailiff had to escort her out, and the judge, shaking his head, turned to Claire and quietly suggested that she expedite the criminal side of the investigation because this woman clearly isn't going to stop until she's forced to. And that's exactly what happened. Within a week, the deputy overseeing the case formally charged Karen with harassment, filing false reports, and attempted fraud. And while those charges alone carried significant weight, the state's attorney reviewing the file hinted there could be additional charges if more victims came forward about the cash dues she had been collecting over the years. The news spread like wildfire, first across the neighborhood and then across the county. Because people loved the irony of HOA Karen being taken down by the very sheriff she had tried to bully, and local reporters even started sniffing around, eager to cover the drama, though Claire tried to keep things as professional and low profile as possible. At home, though, it felt like we had front row seats to the slow motion collapse of Karen's empire of pettiness. And while part of me felt a little sorry for her because clearly she had built her entire identity around this imagined power structure, most of me just felt relief because it meant the constant harassment and nonsense that had tainted our first months in the house were finally coming to an end. But Karen, even as charges loomed, still wasn't done. She tried one last desperate maneuver by showing up on our porch late one night, banging on the door and screaming that we had ruined her life and that the neighborhood will never forgive you. And when Claire opened the door, calm as ever, and simply said, "Karen, you need to leave before you add trespassing to your list of charges," Karen broke down in tears right there on the porch, wailing about how she had given everything to this neighborhood and how no one appreciated her. And for the first time, I saw not anger in Claire's eyes, but pity, because beneath all the noise and the arrogance, Karen was just a lonely, bitter woman who had tried to manufacture importance in a place where she had none, and now it was all unraveling. Still, pity didn't mean forgiveness, and after Karen stumbled away into the night, Claire turned to me and said, "This ends now. I won't let her terrorize people anymore." The final chapter of our ordeal with Karen unfolded in a way that seemed almost cinematic, the culmination of months of escalating drama, harassment, and defiance, finally reaching the point where there could be no more warnings, no more patience, only accountability, and it began on a crisp autumn morning when Claire received the call that a warrant had officially been signed for Karen's arrest on charges of harassment, misuse of emergency services, and fraud, the culmination of the thorough investigation her deputies had carried out with painstaking care to ensure every piece of evidence was airtight, every statement corroborated, every accusation documented, and when Claire hung up the phone and met my eyes across the kitchen table, there was no gloating, no smug satisfaction, just a calm determination as she said, "It's time." Word of the impending arrest spread quickly, though not from us. News travels fast in small communities, and by the time the patrol cars pulled quietly into the neighborhood, several residents had already gathered at the ends of their driveways, murmuring among themselves and craning their necks to watch as deputies approached Karen's house with measured steps. She came to the door in her bathrobe, hair frazzled, clutching that ever-present clipboard as though it were a shield, and at first she tried to bluster, demanding to know what authority they had to be on her property, insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy. But when the deputies calmly read her the charges and informed her of the warrant, the color drained from her face, and for a moment I thought she might faint. Instead, she erupted into a torrent of denial, shouting at the gathered neighbors that they would regret this, that the true HOA would come after them, that she had files and records proving everything she had ever done was justified, but her words only seemed to bounce off the silence of people who were no longer afraid of her, and when the deputies placed her in handcuffs and led her down the walkway, the murmurs among the neighbors grew louder, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others exchanging small smiles of relief. Watching from our porch, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sadness at how far it had all gone, how one person's obsession with control and recognition had spiraled into a full-blown criminal case, and I glanced at Claire, who stood tall and steady, her expression unreadable until the patrol car pulled away with Karen in the back seat, at which point she exhaled slowly and whispered, almost to herself, "It's over." But of course, it wasn't truly over yet, because what followed was weeks of legal proceedings as the county prosecutors laid out their case. Neighbors were called to testify, and Karen, still clinging to her delusions, tried desperately to paint herself as a martyr, a misunderstood leader punished for trying to uphold standards. And though her public defender did their best, the mountain of evidence against her was overwhelming. Each fake notice, each fraudulent fine, each recorded threat was displayed for the court, and each time, the judge and jury alike seemed more astonished that she had managed to get away with it for so long. Claire, though directly involved as a victim, kept her professional distance, testifying only when required, and even then her tone was measured, factual, free of any personal vendetta, which only made her words more powerful, because it was clear to everyone that this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice and the protection of a community from someone who had abused it. By the end of the trial, the verdict was almost inevitable: guilty on multiple counts, with sentencing to include probation, fines, and mandatory restitution to the neighbors she had scammed over the years. When the gavel finally came down, Karen slumped in her seat, the fight drained from her at last. And for the first time since we had met her, she looked small, fragile, almost ordinary, stripped of the illusion of authority she had built her life around. Life in the neighborhood changed dramatically after that. Without Karen's constant interference, people began to breathe easier, lawns grew wild without complaint, kids played basketball in driveways without fear of violations, and neighbors who had once kept to themselves began gathering together, bonded by the shared relief of no longer living under the shadow of an imaginary HOA. One Saturday, a few weeks after the trial, Claire and I hosted a barbecue on our porch, inviting everyone from up and down the street, and the turnout was incredible. Families brought side dishes, kids chased each other across our yard, laughter echoed through the trees, and more than one person raised a toast to Claire, thanking her for finally putting an end to years of harassment. Claire, modest as always, just smiled and said, "I didn't do it alone. You all spoke up. That's what made the difference." And in that moment, I realized how much had shifted, not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood, which had transformed from a place ruled by fear of one woman's clipboard into a genuine community. As for Karen, we didn't see much of her after the trial. She was ordered to attend counseling as part of her sentence, and rumors swirled that she might move away, though others said she was too stubborn to leave the house she'd fought so hard to control. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of her shuffling to her mailbox, head down, no clipboard in sight, and though part of me still felt the urge to gloat, I instead felt only a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, losing everything she thought gave her power would force her to reflect, to change, to find some healthier way to live. For us, though, the ordeal became a story we would tell for years, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the resilience of standing up to bullies. And every time I looked out at Claire's patrol SUV parked proudly in our driveway, I couldn't help but smile, because that vehicle, the very thing Karen had tried so hard to erase, had become a symbol of freedom, justice, and the unshakable truth that no self-appointed HOA Karen could ever stand against the law when the law itself lived right here at home.